This episode is sponsored by Grow Therapy. Grow Therapy was founded on the belief that quality mental health care should be accessible. It makes finding an in-network therapist easy. Go to growtherapy.com to find your match and let insurance pay for your therapy.
Welcome to a place where you'll leave feeling whole. The Counseling Podcast brings at-home counseling right to you, focusing on self-care, self-expression, and breaking down barriers. Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes bring over 20 years of combined experience and a new sense of style to the word counseling. The two use humor and lighthearted conversation to explore these deeper feelings. Let's take the stigma away from counseling together.
Hello and welcome to the Counseling Podcast. I'm Dr. Jaclyn.
And I'm Dr. Stokes.
And today we wanted to address the everyday stressors that we see in our practice and ways to overcome and cope through these daily stressors. I see patients who are struggling with anxiety and relationship issues. So most people feel anxious from common stressors such as fear of failing, losing control, negative thought patterns. And everyday stressors that are common that I see are relationship dynamics such as separation or divorce, life transitions such as job loss or change, financial issues, school and household responsibilities, time management, lack of time for self-care. I see a lot of patients' stress and anxiety manifest from internal obstacles such as their internal thought patterns and internal dialogue. Dr. Stokes, what are you seeing in your counseling office?
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Jaclyn. Thanks. I think it's important for us to first state for our audience that to be able to distinguish the difference between stress and stressors. So stressors are those things in our lives that create the stress. So like a job may be a stressor, or financial issues may be a stressor, or a dysfunctional relationship may be a stressor. But then the stress is your internal system and how it responds to that stressor. And so what I work with a lot of times in my practice with folks is first, us being able to pinpoint the stressors. And I think you did a really good job, Dr. Jaclyn, of doing that, all of just a wide variety of things. But then after we kind of get an idea of what those are, we then start to dive into, okay, well, what is it about these particular stressors that are creating this stress response in your body? And so we work closely on kind of pinpointing, okay, so if let's say you're having difficulties at work, what is it about work? Okay, and the person may say, well, I work 70 hours a week and I've got a boss who's really demanding and I'm really stressed out about that. Well, that would make a lot of sense because you have some unreasonable expectations at work. And so your brain and your body are responding in a way to kind of try to deal with that.
Yeah, that's actually a great, detailed information for our listeners to go further into that. And I know because I do a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy, and we touched on that in our first podcast. And I see a lot of people with that internal thought patterns and internal dialogue. So for example, someone might be stressing about failing either in their personal or professional life. They may create a negative thought pattern that allows them to believe those fears such as, I am not good enough or I won't succeed. So using CBT to help replace those thoughts and practice positive affirmations and focusing on what are the facts? Are my thoughts coming from feelings or facts? I'll explore that with my patients and have them challenge those thoughts by asking questions such as, is there substantial evidence for my thought? Am I interpreting the situation with feelings or facts? And this helps them to take a step back and become more self-aware in those stressful moments and change their thoughts and behaviors to more positive ones.
Absolutely. I think those irrational thought processes and those misperceptions, I call them misperceptions, when people are perceiving things in ways that are not conducive or healthy for, in terms of being able to create coping mechanisms in those particular instances. Absolutely. I think the CBT works really well. And I think kind of coupling that with, the person-centered approach too. And I know that that's your primary approach, Dr. Jaclyn, but just being able to be there with them in that moment so they can have another human being say, hey, look, like that's got to be really, really challenging. But then also, and here's the CBT piece, also I notice though that when you speak to yourself or when you speak to me about this particular issue, I really see that there's some roadblocks going on. Maybe we could make a modification in terms of how you think about this particular stressor.
Sure. And then those are the triggers, right, that people kind of encounter those events, what's my trigger? What gets me to respond or to think that way, and to create a narrative that is negative and go down that pattern, and then that creates the stress for them.
Absolutely. And then it's this snowball effect. And then we see that as people, we do this in other areas of our lives as well. And, a big area that we see this in, and I know you can attest to this because we've both seen it in our practice, is people's relationships and the stress that is caused in relationships. What are your observations as far as that's concerned?
Well, so I work with a lot of couples that have been coming in, and a lot of just the common issues are obviously the money issues, the intimacy issues, different parenting styles, miscommunication, work schedules, allocating chores, trust issues. The common cause seems to be from partners being resentful and blaming, as well as creating, again, their own narrative before understanding their partner. So something happens, they're creating, okay, well, my partner is doing this because of something that maybe they've created or from past events. And that leads them to start wanting to think that this is why I have to prove myself right in these situations, and that inner dialogue they create.
Absolutely. And then that creates a stress response in one individual and then the other individual. And then before you know it, you've got an entire system that's really stressed out. And then all those other additional problems start to really build up, like you said, resentment and miscommunication, and all of these issues. And then you got a really big problem at that point. And how do you work with people to kind of help them de-stress on an individual level? What are some of your approaches in doing that?
Well, because everyone's different, it's kind of like trial and error when you have someone in your practice, and whether they want to do mindful activities of deep breathing, meditation, what are those healthy coping skills that they go to? Some people want to journal, or, I need to remove myself from the situation. I'm going to go work out or take a walk. But I do a lot of let's work on communication, improving the communication and conflict resolution. So listening, active listening, reflections of validating your partner. There's individual coping, and then there's, those coping skills in a relationship.
Absolutely. I use all of the same techniques. And I also, though, I will kind of go back to the root for a lot of them as well. I like to look at, where does, going back to individuals who are stressed out, where did you learn this response? That's what I'll ask folks sometime. It's like, okay, so I see how you're responding. This, you have a boss at work or whatever the case may be, and you're getting really upset, and you're angry all the time, and you're frustrated, and your relationships aren't going so great. But where did you learn this response? And it's amazing because we learn these patterns early on in childhood, and it seems to be helpful for some people to start connecting the dots and getting to the root. And a lot of folks don't necessarily like to go back that far, but I think a lot of folks do get some benefit from it.
No, I completely agree. And it's funny because as we've kind of introduced ourselves as more modern counselors, I tell my clients, it's not, the normal where you're sitting on the couch and have to psychoanalyze your childhood. But then I find myself, well, we kind of really do have to put the pieces together of like, what were those learned behaviors, those core beliefs, who role modeled this communication style for you? That's so important to learn, to give us the piece of information so we can say, okay, this is probably where that comes from. This is the why. And when our clients learn, oh, okay, that makes sense, I can now fix this, or create a better dialogue for myself, so I'm not doing what I was doing in the past.
Definitely. And you mentioned the why. And I think because when we, in many instances, I feel as people, when we know our why, we'll then know how. We'll know how, or what it is that we need to do. And I don't think we always need to know the why, but I think in many instances, it's very important for us to know the why, because people will keep searching for it and they won't even realize that they're searching for it. And, you mentioned pieces too. And I love the analogy that our lives are like puzzles. And, I'll tell folks when they come into my office that, hey, your life is like a puzzle, and, your parents are a piece, your current relationship is a piece, your emotional processes are one, the way you cope is one, and all of these things are different pieces that, we're going to try to fit together to give you a deeper understanding of your own life.
Yeah. And I love too when clients, you see that aha moment on their face of like, okay, that makes sense. I never thought of it like that. And just that's the most important thing. I feel like that people can understand of like, that's why it's so important to come to therapy and to have someone maybe help challenge those thoughts or help you process those thoughts. Like we're here just to kind of give that other perspective that can help you kind of say, oh, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, the glorious aha moment, right? The glory of that look. And I don't know about you, but I've had aha moments as a client in my own therapy when I was getting my own therapy. And it's an amazing feeling to have, those revelations and those moments of great insight that I feel like you can't get anywhere other than therapy. That therapy it has the ability to provide you with the necessary tools and resources to have those really special moments of insight.
Of course. Yeah. And you talk about your own therapy. I mean, we're human, right? So we go through our own daily stressors. We have to stay mindful. And I'm not only giving out these tools, I use them on a daily practice as well. I have to implement this in my life as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I use them incorrectly sometimes. I think sometimes people have a stereotype that therapists, that we have like these perfectly healthy lives, and we don't. We're people, we it's trial and error for us too. But yeah, absolutely, being able to apply the skills and practice what we preach, I think, is a really important part of our profession. And so I think that's definitely a goal for most good therapists.
Of course. And I also work with a lot of people to create those healthy boundaries for themselves, whether individually or in relationships, to reduce those stressors of not feeling like they're sacrificing too much of themselves. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that in patients as well with healthy boundaries?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that the boundaries are absolutely key for stress management. Going back to stress, I think the boundaries are really, they're absolutely vital because they protect someone. And I like to explain to people too that boundaries, they're there for a reason. They're there to protect you, and they're there to protect the other people in your life. Because, there was a great book written about 20 years ago. It's entitled Boundaries by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And it talks all about just the absolute necessity of having boundaries in our relationships. But so many people lack that. So many people were taught, you talk about those old learned behaviors. So many people were taught to have boundaryless relationships, and they go living their lives, and their lives are all convoluted with other people, and they don't have that healthy degree of separation, and that can absolutely create problems.
Yes, exactly. And another thing that I've noticed is people who react, those autopilot responses of something's happening, I'm getting a physical sensation and I'm reacting. So staying mindful again of what's going on, and let's replace what I'm doing to find a better way to handle the situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Just that natural response that I think, again, a learned behavior that people, they get into this pattern of reactiveness. And there's actually I use this model for folks to help reduce that. And I call it the BAR method. And I write it on, I have a little whiteboard by my desk, just a little small 12 by 8 or whatever. But then I write an acronym, BAR. And the first for B is breathe, for A is assess, and for R is respond. And I talk to people about the importance that when you're getting triggered, take a conscious breath, because there's so much to be said for consciously being aware of that breath in the moment, because it connects the mind and the body and will help to stabilize your nervous system. And then the assessment that's the part where you assess the situation, use rational thinking. There's that cognitive behavioral stuff that we were talking about. And then after you've breathed and you've assessed the situation, then respond. Whereas the opposite of that is reacting. Reacting would be punching a hole in the wall, where as breathing, assessing, and responding would be, hey, that was not a nice thing that you said to me. I need some time away from you. I'm not going to punch the wall. I'm going to do something else. Yeah.
Exactly. Do you ever have, those people that are looking at you like, what do you want me to do? Like we might sometimes come up with like creative, like you said, like we came up with BAR, which I think is fantastic. But sometimes I give people activities and they're like, well, how is this going to help me? And rather than just implementing it and saying, okay, this might seem silly, but it's going to help you get into that routine, because right now they're in the routine of doing what they've always done, that autopilot response. So it's easy to stay with what you're doing, even if it doesn't feel right.
Absolutely. Well, that's the resistance, right? That I think most people who are going into therapy, there's going to be some form of resistance because it's really hard to change. And yeah, all the time I will put out a specific coping mechanism that might help with someone, or some sort of strategy, or just some sort of thought that's different than their own. And they kind of look at me perplexed, and sometimes I think a little irritated, because it's like, wait, you want me to do this, and it's like, no, I don't want you to do it, but I think it might be a good idea for you to consider it, but we're so resistant to change as people. And I think that's why, as good therapists, we know we have to be really, really patient with people, because it takes time. It takes time to change these patterns.
Of course. And then those daily stressors, right? They're kind of like, well, where do I find the time to do this? You want me to stop, in my busy schedule and do this? And yes, that's being mindful too, being more mindful of allocating some time for your self-care. That's the most important in your daily stressors. Where do I find time? We're so busy nowadays. We need to go to work. We need to take care of our children. We need to be a wife, mother, sister, brother, all of those things. And when do I have time for myself, my self-care? That's when you're going to stay mindful and help reduce that stress, because you're getting that work-life balance.
Yeah, because if you don't have time in your life to take care of yourself, then what's that mean for your life? Right? Like, if you don't have any of that in your life for you, what does that say about your life? And a lot of people would respond, and I know what this is like, but a lot of people would respond to that and say, hey, look, I got to work. I'm the provider of my family. I've got to do X, Y, and Z. I've got to wake up and make the kids breakfast, and I got to go to work, and I got to make the kids dinner and put the kids down. And I get all that, right? But then there still has to be some sort of strategy to create that self-care regimen. And I call it a self-care regimen for people. And, we look, I think a big part of therapy, as you know, is we're strategists. We help people strategically figure out ways where they can implement these changes and these healthy patterns in their lives. But so many people struggle with that, because our world is so demanding now, right? Dr. Jaclyn, I mean, our world it demands so much out of us.
Of course. And I was actually going to ask, maybe we should divulge a little bit of like what we do for self-care, because life is so demanding. I mean, we try to find time just to, email people through our work schedule. And I know for you and I to find time to schedule certain things, it's a lot. It is a lot. And we do have to prioritize ourselves and invest in ourselves. That's the only way we're going to get that time to refresh. I know for me, I like to have my guilty pleasure of reality TV at night sometimes, and kind of, just zone out after the whole day. Do you have a thing you like to do?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Well, the decompression stuff, absolutely. So I have what I would call my active self-care, and then I have my decompressive self-care. Sure. And my decompression self-care would be things like that, like just zoning out with a movie, relaxing. And then, but my active self-care would be things like, prayer and meditation and exercise, and, the sauna, and going for a run, like doing these things that are where I'm actively investing in myself. And I think we need both sets of those. I think we need the intentional sort of active ones, and then we need some of those where we check out for a little bit,
Yes, that's a great point. I every morning I make sure to get my time for my workout of just my time to kind of think and do that before I start my day. And that's, that helps me. I try to get people to kind of say, okay, if you have a routine, then kind of figure out where you can place that, even if it's 5 minutes.
They've proven it. It's been proven in research, where people who have some sort of routine in the day are usually rate higher on levels of life satisfaction. They have better levels of stress management. They're happier in their relationships. And people hear that and they think, well, how's that? Well, if you have especially people who start their day with a routine, when you're starting your day with a routine, you're starting your day with a philosophy of self-care. You're starting your day with a philosophy of structure, right? And so that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the day, because what it does is it says, I'm taking care of myself, right? And so it's versus, I'm waking up, 20 minutes late. Maybe I was a little hungover from the night before, or whatever the case may be, rolling out of bed, running out the door. And that's the kind of lifestyle where people start to feel problems.
Yeah. And then, people just, this is to feel good. Like, we're doing this to feel good. We want you guys to feel whole and feel good and feel ready to kind of tackle those stressors so you're not going into it with more anxiety.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think this was a great episode for us to kind of share all those. And I'm hoping that our listeners kind of take some of those tips that we spoke about on here and maybe implement that into their daily practice and see if that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I hope so, because these are just real life practical techniques that institute into their lives if they wanted to.
Yeah, well, we want to thank you all for taking the time to listen and be present with us today. Be sure to look out for our next podcast. And until next time, have a wonderful day.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for joining us here today on the Counseling Podcast with Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes. Please take this time to thank yourself for putting in the work. If this episode impacted you in any way, let us know with a loving and honest review. If you have any questions or want to continue the conversation from today, you can reach out to us at thecounselingpodcast@gmail.com, and we can answer your questions right here on the show. Or you can find Dr. Jaclyn and Dr. Stokes on Instagram at docjaclyn and at dr.jeremiah.stokes.